time that I am prepared to, just blanket, let go, out to the internet, whatever happens.
Okay, Bob. Well, I know some of your story because we've chatted on email and Discord and comments, but if this is something that you think you might want to share publicly, you might want to start with a little bit of your story, because I know that has a lot to do with who you are and kind of the way that you've interacted in this whole community. So
Absolutely.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm a little bit of an oddball in that regard, I guess.
Well, we're all odd, trust me.
There you go. My roots actually go back to the Christian Reformed faith. My dad was a pastor in the CRC, so for my childhood, we moved around a lot. He was down at RTS in Mississippi, Reformed Theological Seminary, then he went up to Calvin. He was an interim pastor under Norm Shepherd, so in CRC circles, he's one of those kind of quasi-controversial names. And then we did a stint in Iowa, and then I spent 4 years over in New Zealand and came back, went to boarding school for a little while, went to college, met my wife, settled down, have a family, 5 kids now. So that's, part of the background. Throughout that time, I was very involved with the Christian faith and always exploring it for myself and trying to figure it out. My wife and I and family moved from Minneapolis to Indiana, Lafayette area now, about 5 years ago. And during that time, I took it as an opportunity to kind of separate a little bit from the faith and try to figure it out for myself. I kind of dropped the label Christian for a while. And then, just kind of see where life took me. I have a brother, or I should say had. His name was Tom, and he passed away about 2 years now. He struggled with, it's okay. It's part of the story. It is what it is.
Yeah.
But he struggled with depression for a long time and ended up taking his life. And throughout that time, and obviously very, very painful. It's not exactly fun, but part of the journey. But after that, I thought, okay, what do I know about the medical establishment? And I always wondered to myself, could something have helped him with, get his mind back where it would be what we would consider a healthy, normal individual. And so I started looking into psychedelics. That led to a kind of unexpected mystical experience and changed my worldview substantially. And I guess that's where I am now. So I consider myself a little bit of an amateur mystic, and I think I do have things to say that interact with the meaning crisis, the work that you do, the work that John Zabaki and Jonathan Joe and all those people are doing. I don't keep up with all of them, but I do try to keep up with some of what's going on. There's a lot.
So tell me about the what you go into a little bit more detail about why you sought the psychedelic experience and what was, obviously you're wrestling with, you grew up in the CRC, Christian faith, and it sounds like you were wrestling even before your brother's death.
Absolutely.
And so what gave you, what offered hope or promise about experimenting with psychedelics?
So I think what it is suffering in general. So I've been interested in psychedelics ever since I was a kid. I used to party to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and stuff like that. So that interest goes way back, almost as long as I can remember. Pretty much since the first time I heard them, I was like, that sounds interesting. And I didn't know, and people don't seem to know. It's kind of one of those cultural undercurrents. I've always been interested in whatever is going on, like under the currents, countercultural movements, that sort of thing. And then you could see, they had a really huge impact on the 60s, and the anti-war thing. There seems to be like this element of peace, and you can read trip reports and people talking about their experiences, and there's always yes, it can be dark, but at the end of the tunnel, everything always seemed to be positive in people's lives. So it intrigued me. Not many people know about them. I tend to be willing to try new things, adventurous, that sort of thing, and so that's kind of what brought me into it.
So how did it impact you? What did you learn from it? Is it something you continue to do, or was it more just a little chapter of your life?
Sure. Well, I learned a bunch of things in stages. Like one of the first revelations is this idea that anything can be everything and everything can be anything. That was a DMT revelation. I tried mushrooms. That was where I had the big mystical experience. The trip itself isn't particularly noteworthy in terms of like, you know, I don't like giving the whole trip report thing because whatever, nobody really cares about that. But the insights that came after it are what have kind of molded my life substantially. And I'd like to try to explain some of those insights, but this is one of those, you know, it's not the finger pointing, you know, the moon is not the finger pointing at the moon. So it's very tricky to go through that.
Right. But now, was this something you were doing on your own, or were you in a program or with a group of people that were doing this?
Nope, on my own.
On your own. Okay.
I did all the research in terms of acquiring them. I grew my own mushrooms, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Very much a personal journey. I did have a buddy that I was kind of working with, and he was in his own process of growth and transformation. He hasn't gone quite as deep as I have in some of those areas, but at this point, I could take it or leave it. There's the old saying, once you get the message, hang up the phone. But at the same time, I do see kind of benefit, you know, yearly or something like that. It was kind of an intense period of life for me, but it seems like that's mostly over, and now I'm more on like a maintenance, you know, just for myself sort of thing, maybe a yearly trip or something like that.
Okay. How long ago was that?
The big one was about a year ago. It would have been over the new year.
Okay. And you hold a job, you're married, you have family.
5 kids, accomplished, you know, very busy. You know, I do have a job. I used to work in IT. Now I'm more in materials analyst.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, like, I am kind of a do-it-yourself person. I delivered 2 of my children, one of them without anybody else around. It just happened to be that way. You know, so I've always been kind of adventurous that way. Willing to grab a problem and address it and go through it. It's kind of a piece of that.
Well, how did you find me and this whole strange little community that we've got going now?
I think it would have to be through the Jordan Peterson connection. I was following him back, I'd say back in 2016, with his flash on the campus and all that sort of stuff. And then what's her name, where he did that interview,
Kathy Newman.
Yeah, that one. So yeah, I've been following him for a long time. And then I think it was the fact that you're CRC, you know, that was like, oh, I understand at least a little bit of how you think. And all right. And you're very articulate and seem to be leading the sort of life that I admire. So
okay.
All this guy.
Okay. And so, you know, then we've had some email correspondence, and you've been pretty active in the comment section. You've been on the Discord server. What's your take of this whole meaning crisis and this stuff that's sort of developed? Because I mean, we'll get around to some of the stuff that I know you want to talk about, because
fine.
But what's your take on this whole thing that's happening?
So I see this very much in a very large picture standing. So I see this all as a part of God's story for this world right now. And I think we're getting close to some sort of a weird inflection point. I don't know if mass awakening would be the right word to use. But, you know, I see there's a change going on. The answers that most people understand don't feed the soul in the same way that they're needing right now. And so they're looking for something different, and they don't know where to look because there's no good authorities to kind of point them in the right direction. I think churches are trying to be that and get that role back. And I think that's part of what's going on here with the work that you're doing and the meaning crisis in general, or even John Vervaeke. I mean, he's looking at the religion of no religion, and but gathering psychotechnologies together that help people transcend their former selves and become the better version of themselves. But yeah, so I see it very relevant in what's going on in society.
Okay. Well, let's go. The time is yours, so let's go where you want to go with this. How would you like to begin?
Well, fair enough. I guess my own personal goal. I was thinking of like, what can I say to him? And the thing that jumped in my head was like, okay, my goal is to reunite the East and West churches and all of humanity. And I'm aiming high. This is my life path, the hero's journey, and we'll see if we can do it. But
okay,
give it a go. So I guess the first thing I'd like to talk about is dreams, because I find them quite interesting. Again, like trips, not so much a specific dream or anything like that, but structure of dreams. The first thing that jumps out to me about dreaming is that they tend to be very immersive, right? Like you're in a dream, but you don't necessarily recognize that you're in it, and you're just kind of going along with whatever the story is. They tend to be populated in an instant with all kinds of stuff, whole new worlds just appearing in a blink of an eye, quite literally. But then there's also like these other weird things about dreaming, like what do you call it? Lucid dreaming. I don't know if you're familiar at all with that phenomenon, but a lot of people have them. A couple of my kids have it, but it's where you wake up in the dream and you kind of realize you're both in the dream and the dreamer of the dream. Oftentimes you get very interesting, you know, like you can manipulate it in certain ways. And there's even techniques to help you do that, which is kind of interesting to me. Like they call them reality checks. So you start doing things like pulling your finger in reality. Well, if you pull your finger in a dream, it'll maybe stretch out or do something weird. And that's supposed to be the trigger that, oh, I must be sleeping. Now I can start manipulating this dream. The reason that I find dreams important is because I'm a non-dualist sort of person, which is basically that there's only one thing that exists, and the only thing that exists is God, and God is this thing called consciousness. And God is therefore like the dreamer of this reality that is our world. And so I take these ideas about the dreams and I say, okay, let's crank them all the way up to infinity, or 11 if you like your, what's it? Anyways, crank it up to infinity. So like the immersiveness of this reality is as immersive as it gets. But nobody questions what this reality is. The size of the dream is obviously, you know, infinite. Like this reality is infinite as far as anybody can tell. And I believe that the concept of the lucid dreamer actually applies to your sages, your saints, Jesus, Buddha, those sorts of people, where they've kind of woken up, realized, oh, I am both the character in the dream as well as the dreamer outside the dream. And there's your identification with God. I and the Father are one, things of that nature. So I see them very relevant that way. But
okay, you know, you and I have talked quite a bit about this. Part of my thing with dualism is, or with non-duality, is it's. I always wonder, okay, why is there so many other things?
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, because then you're sort of left with, well, all differentiations, all dualities, all multiplicities are illusory. And that's sort of a problem, because then you have the question, well, what is illusion and where does that come from? Because if you have truth and illusion, well, now you've got two things. And so, I mean, that's, so when I hear non-duality, I always think, okay, so is there duality and non-duality? Because then we have a duality. I mean, these things just multiply all over the place.
Well, it's one of those where it depends on which side of the framework you're looking at. So,
but that's the point. There's always sides.
Well, okay, how do you say it? There's the unified side, and then there's the multiplicity side. Well, but you see this in your own mind with your own dreams. Like if you're having a dream, there's the multiplicity of things in the dream, but it's all generated by one consciousness.
As far as we know.
As far as we know.
I mean, because we don't. I mean, dreams are such interesting things, and not just dreams themselves, but the conversations around dreams. I mean, the near ubiquitous assumption throughout the ancient world that dreams were significant to a far greater degree than most people within our culture assume dreams are. Yeah. The dreams have sort of become in our culture, well, this is just mental bookkeeping that we do at night.
It's a thing that happens, and there's no meaning to be gained from them.
Right, and there's not only, but you know, one of the things that Jordan Peterson mentions in his, in his first, in his biblical series, where you know, he asked this question, which is a really good question. Where does the information in dreams come from?
Mm-hmm.
Because, and he makes the point, which obviously is basic to the, you know, to any of the depth psychologists, that we seem to know things. So there's me, you know,
Mm-hmm.
this thing, Paul Vanderklay, that I am conscious of, that I identify myself. There's the me, but there's things I know that I don't necessarily know, but in
Mm-hmm.
many ways they are still within me. They're in my brain, they're in my mind. I might not be conscious of them,
Mm-hmm.
but, and so Jordan Peterson's question, where does the information come from? And the fact, when he was working with clients, using their dreams and talking about their dreams, the fact that we learn from dreams,
Mm-hmm.
you know, so even then, see, this is where the non-duality, I just don't find it a helpful phrase, because I learn from dreams. And so
Mm-hmm.
right there again, we have a duality, that these dualities just keep multiplying all over the place, which,
So I reject the I in that. That's the piece of the statement that I think is false. That's the part of the illusion. In fact, I would go straight to Genesis 1 in that. And I'd like to see if I can explain Genesis 1, the I,
okay,
in non-dual terms.
okay,
So I want to try to actually link this up too with the science of the brain. So have you heard of the default mode network?
no,
Okay, it's a piece, or it's a network in your brain that is kind of on by default. And there's research being done in this, that when you lower or I don't know, constrict, whatever, when the default mode network stops being used, that's when you start having mystical experiences. And the default mode network is responsible for two things. One is it's kind of like it's a sense of I that wants to keep itself alive. So it runs around, it's worried about itself, all that sort of stuff. The second thing that it does is it has a sense of time. So as soon as that network is engaged, you start seeing things in terms of time, past, present, future. Now, I bring this thing up because I want to hook it directly into Genesis in the fall. So to me, when I read that story—
before we go there, I just want to drop in a note here that, you know, when I talked to James, my friend from the local meetup, and he was on my channel, and the first talk I did with him that we did about psychedelics, I mean, I think his assertion was, and he can correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section, I think his assertion was that it's basically one of the things that we suspect psychedelics do is in fact take that offline.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so anyway, so go ahead.
So anyway, yeah. So if you're looking then at the fall of man, that whole story, you've got what I believe is the default mode network coming online in humanity. So now all of a sudden, you know, there's this separation. It's not like an animal where you're running around and doing animal things unconsciously. You're actually start becoming aware. The rider becomes put on top of the elephant, and it's saying, I'm afraid of everything because everything can kill me. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I mentioned the time. That's reflected in planting and harvesting. Now you have to toil for what you're doing, because all of a sudden there is a future that I have to look out for. It's not, you know, the universe provides me what I need today, otherwise, you know, whatever. But it's more, I can see in the future, I can see the effects of my actions I've taken, and those things get combined into a larger story. So the default mode network comes online. That's also the seat of what we would call the ego, or the sense of I. So, you know, you think of yourself as Paul doing things. I think of myself, you know, typically as a Bob doing things. Everybody else in the world seems to be behaving that way, so that must be what it is. We're all just kind of these separate individuals. Now, I don't consider the default mode network an evil thing. You know, some people like to throw that in there or disregard, or, you know, kind of diminish it that way. I think it is definitely a necessary part of humanity, one of God's gifts, but we take it a little bit too seriously, and that's where our problems come in. Because now all of a sudden, I'm competing with you for resources. You know, this is Cain and Abel. I'm going to kill you because you're blessed and I'm not. So I want what you're having. And so that puts us in opposition with each other, not only the rest of the universe, but also with each other. But yeah, so when you have one of these mystical experiences, that network breaks down. You see a little bit through this illusion of what's going on, and the identity, in my case anyways, went back to the Godhead, at least for a short period of time. Like, oh, I am the dreamer and in the dream at the same time. That's how it is. Now, it doesn't stay there permanently, but it feels that way.
Does my dog have this default no mode
No,
network?
that I don't know. I don't know dog anatomy that well.
but dog psychology. I mean,
Mhm.
do you have a dog, or have you ever had a dog?
I do have a dog.
Okay,
Yes.
so one of the things, I mean, so I currently have a little dog, but before this I had two Rottweilers. They were brother and sister, and if you just watch dogs, this is pretty common knowledge. Many animals with dominance hierarchies, we'll use that
Mhm.
term. If I would give the food to both of the dogs together, Macho, who was the male, would eat first, eat all he wanted, and Mocha, who was the female, would get whatever was left over.
Sure.
And so this, to the degree that, so I now have a dog, and he's a little dog, and he lives in the house with us, and he's got typical little dog syndrome, in that he's terribly insecure and afraid of the whole world, and that makes him snippy. He's always biting people, but fortunately his bite doesn't do much. So
Sure.
So it's, when I hear, I think when you read Genesis 2 is such an interesting story in the way, the transformation happens in Genesis 2 and 3. The naked discover they're naked. I mean, it is just such a evocative story on so many levels. It's inexhaustible. But when I think about it in the terms that you've just described, I can understand in some ways how the story evokes the creation of the ego, but it is difficult to not see ego in Adam, for example, when he's presented with Eve. And in Adam's, in the little part of the story where Adam is meeting and naming the animals, and so
Sure.
So I don't know. I don't know how that strikes you.
I guess I wouldn't necessarily take it as a literal account of what's happening. But for those answers, I would actually go to the Origins and History of Consciousness. I know a couple of other people have brought that book up on your podcast here. But to me, like that's like part of the symbolism of the story. Because like when I hear it, the things that jump out at me is Adam walks with God first and foremost. So the separation between those two is not yet complete. When the ego comes online, now all of a sudden there's this nakedness where it's like, oh, I'm afraid of what's out there because everything can harm me. And so there's that vulnerability. Okay, I need to clothe myself for protection from even just the simple elements. And then, yeah, I don't see, like, even the naming of the animals to me is creating duality. Like, it's one, like, you can look at animals from animals, they're all animals. And so our ego does this job of parsing things up. I'm looking at your bookshelves in the background there, and the ego puts things in boxes. So you've got rows of things, books are all square. I work in a warehouse, so everything's on pallets, in boxes, on pallet racks. Everything is box and box and box, because that's what the ego likes. It likes things orderly in that very straightforward way. It doesn't like, the mystery, so to speak.
But we're still left with ego and non-ego. And see, this is always my thing with the non-duality.
Sure, yeah.
I can't help but see dualities.
Fair enough. Yeah. I mean, fair enough. And I would see ego as like a little bit of that valve where you can increase it when you need protection from something, or decrease it when you don't. I don't know.
And I guess part of what I've always seen in this perspective is also, how do you differentiate between non-ego and death?
So that's an interesting one. I don't. Okay. So when ego,
which is what I suspect.
Yeah. When Jesus talks about you must be born again, what I think he's talking about is having some sort of a death experience. So an ego death feels very much like a regular death, at least as far as I know. because that thing that says I am Bob starts screaming in agony because it realizes that it's dissolving. And then all of a sudden you open up and it's like, oh, I get the story. This is God playing all the parts. He's doing this, I'm doing this, I guess, take the first person, for my own pleasure, for my own glory. I mean, that's what's going on here is this cosmic play with itself. There's no other like characters there. I mean, that gets into the question then of like, how could there be another character? I mean, we've got the idea of creation, but there's no other, how can this nothingness that we assume exists and underpins everything, how could there be something other than nothing? Well, there's God, but then how does there get to be something else in that?
Right.
So,
right.
So I've got, I've got problems there. But the interesting thing about it, though, is if you adopt this sort of view, I don't know if you've noticed, but it kind of solves, the question of omniscience and omnipotence and omnipresence. All those are kind of solved in this thing, because there is nothing but God. So God is therefore everywhere. There is no other power other than God. So God is omniscient in that regard. God is all-knowing because everything that is known by anybody is therefore known by God. It's the being that's looking out through all the eyes and perceiving the universe.
I guess the issue I always have with it is it's sort of like the solution to cancer is death. Or the solution to cancer is the circle of life. And the circle of life is ironically named because the circle of life is also death. And so whenever someone proposes this solution to me, and when I think about Christian tradition, I think first of all, Christianity has a trinity where and functional to the trinity is this is the I thou. It's the me and not me. And what comes also, central to Christianity is of course also love. And love is the relationship between the lover and the beloved. And so and what I see in terms of the difference between the little I understand of Buddhism and Christianity is that the end state, the eschaton, finally does not destroy my ego, but perfects it.
Okay.
And in that sense, it's not only simply duality in terms of me and not me, but it's an enormous duality where there are, like in the book of Revelation, there are, multitudes, there are multitudes of individuals, assumedly with egos remaining. And so...
Well, part of that depends on what you mean by ego remaining. So, for example, like I still answer to Bob. I mean, I don't have any problems with that. And so there is something that it is like to be specifically me with my memories and my familial attachments and all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, sorry, my mind just spun off sideways and I lost my place. I apologize.
That's okay.
It happens. So there is definitely an I, but it's a muted I, and it's not like I don't identify with Bobness. It's not like the Bob is important. It's the spirit that is in Bob that is important. And that's a thing that is shared amongst all things. And, even I was thinking about the idea of memory. Okay, so this is something that we have. And in the Christian eschatology, there's always, the new heaven, the new earth. There's this place where people are put back in. And to me, even the word remembered is a remembering as in body of what's happening. And this is something that God as the infinite consciousness can do. It can create, for lack of a better word, new bodies, because it remembers what the old thing, you've talked about, like, what does it mean to be you? How far back do you go? Like, is the 1-year-old you anything like modern Paul? Well, they're related in genetics, but, and there's a sense of continuity between them. But even that sense of continuity is broken up every night, and you just assume it happens, But like, how do you navigate that world too? So, I don't know.
Yeah, well, and that's and so then I see two story possibilities. I see one which is that um that basically the extinction of whatever it is that I am,
Hmm.
which or the absorption of me
Hmm.
into some grand thing, which is
Hmm.
analogous to, let's say, the death of me and the worms eating my body, and the animal eats the plant, the circle
Hmm.
of life. There you go around.
Hmm.
Versus, I think the Christian vision of resurrection, which is the perfection of me, and that in a way, this stuff is just always so hard to talk about.
Well,
Um,
perfection into what?
well, exactly, but perfection into the me, into a me that I can't quite see yet, but
Hmm.
which will still be me and not just us.
Yeah. So I guess, like there is a Jesus and a Paul, there will always be, a Paul and a Bob. But even Paul, when he's talking about, or the Apostle Paul, when he's talking about his relationship, he says words like, "What? It is not I that live, but Christ that lives in me."
Right.
And so you have this notion of the emptying of the self in some way
Yes.
that is then filled and made new.
Yes.
Even the idea of being a co-heir. We're
Yes.
supposed to be co-heirs with Christ. Well, co-heirs of what?
Yes.
This world, this planet? Okay. To me, that's still kind of small, especially for claiming that God is divine. that God is divinity. So the co-heirness to me has to be that of divinity. Otherwise, you know, immortality, okay, and I can understand it in terms of, like, I'm not going to eternally be able to just think and be anywhere I want to in the universe, or do heaven and earth, that sort of thing. But there's still this element of, we are meant to be divine, whatever that means. We are part of this immortality that exists already.
Yeah, and that word, I should probably do a word that fudges on the word divine, because it's such a tricky thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think, for example, that part of what I see with non-duality is that, and it very quickly leads one into saying that, well, for example, I had no beginning.
Mm-hmm.
um and I think human beings are everlasting, not eternal. Eternality is, again, one of these tricky concepts
Mm-hmm.
where, it's timeless. It's not long time, it's timeless. And I mean, this stuff, you get, I mean, it's very similar. I don't know if you saw the Peugeot Vervaeke conversation from a
Mm-hmm.
couple that was
Yeah.
posted a couple days ago. I mean, they get into some of this stuff, and I like the way Jonathan talked about how, in a sense, I think of this, imagine it sort of like C.S. Lewis's discarded image, that, in the medieval world, you had all of these planets, and
Mm-hmm.
Planet Narnia talks about, maybe that's what Lewis was doing with his Narnia stories. But you get up above the moon layer, for example, and it's a very different thing. And so it's person and duality, and then, say, mystics hit a certain point, and, well, then there's non-duality, and okay, I can hear that. But as Peugeot said, you come back down, it's all duality and person and everything again.
Yep.
So you get to the point of, let's say, so let's, I just don't know that, um I just don't know that attempting to live above the moon is a game worth playing beneath the moon. I don't know if that
Sure.
makes any sense.
So it does, kind of. I So what I gathered out of that conversation is two gentlemen who are kind of circling the idea, and they're not willing to stop and say, okay, the ramifications of this are that Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke don't actually exist, and or to be more presumptuous, that their essence is somehow divine or that there's divinity there. And I think the reason that people, most Christians, John and Jonathan, don't like doing this is because there's this element of arrogance to it. Like, what are you saying? That you're God? Blasphemous. And this is the same exact counter that they gave to Jesus when he went around talking. And I agree with that. Like, it's a very bold claim. How do you back it up? Pull yourself down off that cross, the whole 9 yards. I totally understand. But it is, from my perspective, that sense of ego, that sense of personal I that needs to die at least once so that you can be reborn and understand, oh yes, I am a part of that, but my place is now this. So from my eyes, this is very much a new heaven and new earth already, because what I see is not just other people, but I'm seeing myself reflected in them. And they are things that, as a part of this God, which is love, that I should love. Like, that's what I'm doing. So when Jesus is talking, he lays out the first two commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. To me, those two things are the same thing. You're actually, by loving others, you are loving God in all these other different forms. And that's what God should be doing, is loving itself, because God is love. And so there's this kind of calling back, God through these other human forms to love itself all the more. Is kind of, I don't know, that's how I see it.
Again, part of what, so when I hear this perspective on the world, and I ask myself, now, if this is true, and this is the reality that I should live into, I don't know that I'd talk to you or anyone else.
Fair enough. And there is a little bit of that. Like, there's definitely a lot of non-dual teachers who are like, oh, this is just reality doing its thing. This is happening. Whatever happens is okay. And that's definitely a perspective that you can have on it. The other perspective that I think most people end up with is that there's almost a, for lack of a better word, a compulsion. I think if I was the Apostle Paul, I might say a slavery to the message itself. It's not something that, to me, there's not like a Bob that's saying, oh yeah, I get to pick this or rebel against this or whatever. It's just something that I kind of have to do. I need to explore this in certain ways, and I, feeling that out as I go.
But again, when I think about that, I would think that is a betrayal of the truth that I guess I always, because obviously this isn't new. These aren't new ideas. These are very old ideas.
Very old ideas.
And they've been around and had expression in a variety of religious traditions, especially in Buddhism and some forms of Hinduism. And again, not an expert on any of those things. But as even reading a cursory reading of some fairly introductory materials in some of these ideas, when I think it through, I always think, then I completely understand being a monk in a saffron robe, meditate, devoting your life to meditation, because at that point, what you're doing is you are continually realizing the eschaton, and begrudgingly having to do things like consume nourishment for the illusory body that I've yet not been able to break from the compulsion to maintain, and simply allow this existence to join the oneness in to join the oneness of the biosphere doing its thing without ego, without mind, for whatever it does. And I think that way, and it's like,
it doesn't sound fun.
Well, not only, but of course, fun would be an expression of the ego. And I can understand in some ways the attraction of it, but I don't know how it, I guess I don't know how it yields glory in the way that my understanding of Christianity does. The
Okay.
the glory of duality, and celebration of glory is in fact not simply ego, but
Mm-hmm.
it's a strange, and I've often made the case that God is most humble, partly because he's unseen,
Mm-hmm.
because he lets those who manifest the glory have the glory. And
Mm-hmm.
it's, he's like I use the illustration of the baker who bakes the most glorious cake you could imagine and
Mm-hmm.
quietly watches the eaters enjoy,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
watches because this is what the psalmists do, watch the eaters retell the glory, because in
Mm-hmm.
the Psalms, that's always, glory is manifest by someone saying, I'm going to glorify Bob. So Bob, you sit down and let
Sure.
me tell the world how glorious Bob is. And I don't find that in
Mm-hmm.
non-duality.
I I think I think many non-dual teachers, and definitely the writing, tends to be focused more on the other side, the recognition of self as part of the dreamer, so to speak. But there is definitely a strain of people that are focused more on the re-embodying those truths. So in Buddhism, they've got a, a little tale that talks about what the farmer does as he is learning or learning the non-dual path. At first you're a little bit interested. They talk about it in terms of like the bull, and the bull runs away, and you see like the tail of it, and then you see like the hindquarters or something, and then eventually you sit back on the bull and you ride it back into town. And the whole point though is then to re-embody with whatever you're doing. One of the I guess sayings is, before awakening, carry wood, chop, or chop wood, carry water. After awakening, carry water, chop wood. So you're doing the exact same sorts of things. You're trying to re-embody what is the the glory that you see, and the recognition when you're looking around. You're like, oh, all of this is God in all these different forms. It is a very glorious thing. It stops being, why am I in this earth, in this depressed place? Why am I spending time in this warehouse? Now all of a sudden you start seeing the mystery in everything. And so I think that my experience anyways has been that it's added more glory, not less. So
Again, I've thought, I I read and I think, and I've read materials on this, and each time I look through it, I think, nah, I wouldn't want to trade what I've got for that.
fair enough. Well, here's one of my questions, and this is something that I've kind of pondered on over years, ever since I was a kid. And I know it seems ridiculous, but it's a concept of aliens, as in outer space, right? And I don't bring this up because I care that much about aliens, but because of the thought patterns that it leads us down. Yeah. So if we take the story of Jesus Christ as taught in the vast majority of churches everywhere, and that is that Jesus is a singular figure, God becoming man, and never shall that ever happen again. Nobody else can have those sort of awakening experiences and recognize this. Then what does that mean for something like the alien? And if you bring it down to just our earthly level, what does that mean for the Buddhists or the Hindus, right? But again, on a cosmic level, how do we presume then to say, hey, you need to understand Jesus, otherwise, yeah, I recognize you got here from another galaxy and traveled light years, but your metaphysics are wrong. You need to understand Jesus, otherwise it's not going to work. And so this concept of universalizability, is that a word? I don't know. How do you take this story and make it something that is sufficient for the entire universe? And my understanding with that is that usually you end up in a position, well, maybe the earth is the center of the universe and there's nothing else out there other than people. Or, they got to come here in order to learn the truth. Or, so you run into all these kind of like issues with that doesn't seem to be how we would function. So whatever the story is, whatever the narrative is, that the metaphysics behind everything has to be something that can be universalizable. And I don't see that in the human being known as Jesus, but I can see that very clearly in the Christ story as somebody who has woken up, recognized both sides of being in the dream and outside the dream, and that those two things have never actually been disconnected. And so I guess I would wonder what would your response to something like a challenge like that be?
Well, I don't know, but is the issue beneath it one of access, that only certain groups of people get to access the unique revelation of Jesus, and therefore other people are out in the cold? Is that the kind of the nub of the problem you're looking at?
I wouldn't say it that way. Although, I mean, that's a piece of it, but it's also, how do you authoritatively balance two different stories from two different cultures, or two different planets, or two different solar systems? Like, how do you determine which one is truth, which one is falsehood? How do you mediate whatever that is? And if your story is tied up into a person, like if truth depended on this guy Bob, then that would die with me. So to me, there has to be something deeper that transcends even the person of Jesus. And so access is a piece of that. But
this gets into the whole question of the I was going to say the democratization of knowledge, or the democratization of salvific tools, where the problem with Christianity, and I think a lot of this comes out of the formulation that's very popular in kind of the evangelical perspective, that there's this, so you've got salvation and you've got perdition, and the path to this runs through, now here's where we have to be careful, because the path to this either runs through a certain subscription concerning Jesus Christ, and if you set it up that way, then you have a real problem, because all these other people, they haven't had sufficient opportunity in order to subscribe to this specific.
It's the whole issue of belief. The
whole issue of belief to Jesus. I mean, that's obviously a fairly common conversation, and if you look at some of the constituent elements of that problem, you begin to see that, well, there are a lot of issues going on there, and really on both sides, because one side of it is, well, God is unfair because we assume that a good God would make participation in a blessed afterlife available to every significant entity, assuming that significant entity is limited to human being soul-bearing things. I mean, and so that whole problem is just sort of set like that. But some of those assumptions beneath them are also problematic, in that, why should God make this? And here's where you and I get into some interesting conversations in our own tradition of single or double predestination. Could a good God not allow these? I've never had a lot of difficulty with that, partly because I think in many ways in terms of if the problem is set up in that way, it's simply a function of the system. It would sort of like be asking, why was my dog not given the grace to be born as a human being?
Sure. Yeah.
Well, my dog is a dog and a human is a human, and so but there are hosts of conversations and problems within all of that. But as, let's say, comparing your perspective, say the non-duality, the understanding of non-duality as, let's say, a facsimile or an equivalent to what Christians would call salvation, you have exactly the same problem with all kinds of people who are insufficiently being able to experience and
I would disagree with that.
Embodied non-duality, because
I don't view salvation quite that way. I would look at it, again, going back to kind of the dream analogy. Everything is saved because everything is a part of the dream. So that's kind of what it is. And some of the Eastern traditions have ideas of like karma and stuff like that, and I can't speak to those things. What happens after an actual physical death, and is there a method for scraps of Bob's consciousness that need further purification to be re-embodied and live another life? I don't know, maybe. And that answer seems to work for people in the East, where they've got like stronger reincarnation ideas going on. I don't see it as much in the West, but who knows? But as far as salvation, to me, everything is saved, including the worst of the worst, because they're all a part of this dream, and God loves itself eternally, even the parts that are unlovely by us. I'd even throw your Hitlers and Stalins in that bucket, and I would say, that's a part of this. God is playing those parts as well as every other part. But it does get into, there's an interesting tie-in with the idea of Satan and the serpent. For whatever reason, it's popping back in my head, going back to the default mode network. Satan is there in the garden, and the Satan is called the deceiver, right? To me, the greatest deception is that sense of I. And you see this also reflected in the book of Job, where you've got God and Satan and Job, and then all these other characters that are some condemning God and curse God and die. You've got his family that's being killed off, and the presumably raiders that are killing them off, and this whole world of stuff happening. And so when I look at that, I see Job as one of these characters who is, again, a lucid dreamer of our reality. And he's woken up and he recognizes, oh, I'm both the dream, outside and inside. And so my only response in that situation would be to, yeah, I'm confused. Why is all this happening? But I can't curse God, because that's cursing myself. And that's,
people curse themselves all the time.
Absolutely they do. Absolutely they do. But they do so from the position of thinking, I'm here suffering. Like this is my lot. I just got rolled the bad hand, and there's no meaning in any of this. And in that situation, absolutely curse yourself.
What's your take on Jordan Peterson's assertion that suffering is the one thing that you can't deny?
Suffering is definitely something that people experience. I think we tend to increase our suffering with our mental anguish around it. So it's not the needle that hurts you when you get a shot. It's your fear of the shot that hurts you when you get the shot. So suffering itself is, if I get a cut, I'm having some sensations in my body. If I close my eyes, I can think about it. Oh, there's that sensation of something happening there, like a pain. I might feel like the blood on my arm or something like that. But all suffering kind of boils down into that sea of sensations that is our existence. Is it real? Well, it's real for this body, but it's not real in terms of the eternalness that is a person.
But we have another duality.
So, I mean, you go back to the dream analogy. What happens in a dream? Do you suffer in your dream?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, how do you talk about that in the proper way? Because it's like, yeah, my character in the dream suffered. That kind of sucked while I was in it, but then I woke up and it was all, nothing. It disappeared and evaporated. So did I suffer? I don't know.
I was suffering during the dream.
During the dream.
Anybody who remembers any of their dreams knows we certainly suffer
Sure.
sometimes in dreams. You have a dream of the death of a loved one, or a particular loss, or a particular frustration, and then you have the question, well, this why doesn't this dreaming God only have good dreams? I mean, he's putting all these millions of people through misery for what? For nothing. There's no meaning in it. What is the meaning of the suffering in my dream?
Mm-hmm. I think there is an element where you can say, okay, everything is meaningless. If everything is God, then everything is meaningless. Yes, but there's also, I think, that deeper meaning of showing God's love, which I believe is the core of what this consciousness is a love for itself, to all the other forms to the best of your ability. So I think
what is love in non-duality?
God. I mean, God is love.
But what isn't God in non-duality?
What isn't God?
Yes.
Nothing. So, I mean, there is nothing but God. Now, there's the appearance of suffering and of people and of things and objects, just like there's appearance of those things in your dreams. But all that exists at the end of that dream is your consciousness doing the dreaming.
it, 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 it just has no attraction to me.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I don't blame you. I don't blame you. Well, I guess, I don't know what your time limit is. I'm open-ended, but the last thing I would wrap it up though with it would be like, there's a challenge here though, because these are states of mind that people can have, and so
that's what I don't get about non-duality is
sure.
I don't see any challenge in it at all.
Oh, there's absolutely a challenge, because it says to the other religions and other ways of thinking about things, is your God large enough to understand this? Is your God large enough to let go of that self? And what does that mean? And
but the other religions aren't anything either, or they're everything too.
Sure, yeah.
So where's the challenge? I mean, it's like, okay, let's use the same metaphor. I'm in a dream and I'm thinking there's a should in my dream, but the illusion is that there isn't a should, that there just is. And any should is illusory. And so, okay.
Should is a story that we tell ourselves. I mean, that's our ego coming up and saying it ought to be. I'm putting myself in the place and deciding, and this is how.
So then, from where do you get your challenge?
I would say that the challenge to, I mean, there's not like in an absolute sense, like you know, whether or not you believe this or not doesn't affect anything. I mean, that is what it is. I would say the challenge, though, is can your conception of God, whatever that looks like, withstand the results of employing the psychotechnologies that will ultimately lead to a non-dual thinking? And in my case, it didn't. Like, I had to modify what I understood and what I thought about Jesus and God and all those sorts of things, because those ideas failed. And with the experience that I had, those ideas were found wanting. So to get back to the idea of challenge, it's like, okay, if I tell you you can fly, if we're living around the time of Wright brothers, I say, hey, I can fly. You say, no, you can't. Well, the challenge is get on the plane. Let's see what happens. And John Vervaeke talks very often about like these one-way doors, like the birth of a child. Your life from that point forward is changed. You can't see through the door. You can't anticipate what's on the other side. There's no way to understand it until you've started embodying it. And I mean, that is one of those problems with non-duality. You can't convince somebody of this. It's not a rational thing that you can go up and hey, let me lay out my formula and it just all works. But
oh, Bob.
I know, right? But here's part of the journey too. Look out for it, because I feel like I'm a little early in some of this stuff, at least in the modern culture.
It's very old.
Well, it is very, very old. Absolutely. It's very old thinking. But in modern day America, you could probably count the number of non-dualists on a couple of hands. But I guess.
But don't count them. They're all one. It's easy to count.
Absolutely. Which is, yeah. It's true. I mean, you can look at it that way.
All the accountants, they're out of a job. One. I don't mean to be flippant, but
no, I understand. Like, I get it. Like, there's definitely there's that sense of it. But I see, like legalization of psychedelic efforts it's going to lead to a lot of people that are having these experiences. And I think the challenge to pastors and other people is to say, well, how do we take that? What are you doing with that? And how do we incorporate that into what we're teaching? Because, ultimately, isn't experience something like truth. That's how we come to know it.
Yeah, let's say I mean, because the irony, of course, is that these ideas have been around for a very long time, and I'll hear people say things like, "Oh, if we all just embrace non-duality, then wars would end." Well, you look into the places of the world where non-duality has been around for a very long time, and they've had plenty of wars too.
Absolutely.
Um, I, I'm just skeptical. I'm just skeptical.
I'm not pushing it as like a set of things to be believed.
But you
So
can't push it because
no, of course
it
not.
makes no sense in your system.
Absolutely, it doesn't. But I don't know.
All right. Well, at least, well, I think people will, just in terms of I think people will want to see your face, and because you've made this point, in the comment section and in the Discord server. So, if you'd like me to share this, I'm certainly happy to share it.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure people will probably want to follow up with you and in various different ways. So
I would appreciate any conversation. I actually really enjoy this sort of stuff.
well, I enjoy it too, Bob. I'm glad you got a slot, and I don't want to I don't want my pushbacks to be taken as aggression or.
Oh, absolutely not.
I didn't think they were, but I certainly don't mean it that way. I'm just expressing my honest response because I've read these ideas, I've thought about these ideas, I've looked at these ideas, and I'm just sharing why I don't find these ideas attractive or compelling to me. But obviously, that's not a problem in your system because I'm just and
You're doing exactly what you should be doing.
And there's plenty of someone. I mean, people on a daily basis recognize the enormous inconsistencies in my thought and the enormous gaps and flaws and loopholes. And I mean, my thinking is riven with those things too. And and so I appreciate you sharing this with me. And I appreciate your participation on the channel and in the Discord, and I appreciate you telling me your story.
Thank you. I appreciate the forum here and participating in all those ways. I love the conversations. I'm happy to have them with anybody. This is, to me, this is a delight. It's finding those inconsistencies. Sometimes, little turns of phrase or whatever might spark an idea, and away you go.
Yeah.
But somebody wants to reach out and contact me, I'd be happy to have another conversation.
Okay. Well, I'll post this. It'll probably come up. What day is today? Today's Wednesday. Probably this week or next week. I'll probably post it. So.
No worries. I'll keep my eyes out.
Okay, Bob. It's good talking to you.
Have a good one.
Okay. Bye-bye.